Okay, hello everyone. My name is Veronica Hutchison, and I am the managing symposium editor for the Michigan Journal of Law Reform. This is our annual symposium titled Reimagining Police Surveillance, where today we will be discussing protest movements and how police surveillance technologies have impacted those movements in various ways. So to kick off the event, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Professor Steinberg. He is a professor here at Michigan Law who focuses on civil rights and civil liberties and is very invested in the Michigan Law Clinic community. So we're really thankful to have him here. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Steinberg.
Well, thank you, Veronica, and welcome to the panel on surveillance of social movements and public protests. This is a tremendous symposium organized by the Journal of Law Reform, and I'm thrilled to be able to moderate this panel of such accomplished attorneys and activists who are truly leaders in the field. This topic is very near and dear to my heart, and I've had the opportunity to work on cases addressing the issues being discussed today, both when I was at the ACLU of Michigan and now through my clinic at MLaw, the Civil Rights Litigation Initiative. So if you're interested in working on these issues, I encourage you to think about applying for CRLI. In any event, I'm just going to briefly introduce the speakers, and then we'll start right out with a few questions. Initially, Jack Schulz is an attorney serving as co-lead counsel representing Detroit Will Breathe and 14 individuals in a lawsuit against the city of Detroit and several individual defendants arising from excessive brutality against Black Lives Matter protesters during the racial justice protests in 2020. Jack is a member of the Lawyers Committee of the ACLU of Michigan and is on the Institute for Continuing Legal Education Litigation Advisory Board. Rachel Levinson-Waldman serves as Deputy Director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, which seeks to advance effective national security policies that respect constitutional values and the rule of law. She is active on issues relating to policing and technology, and in particular provides commentary on various modes of surveillance used by law enforcement, including in the immigration context. Albert Fox Cahn is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project's founder and executive director. If you didn't catch it, that's an acronym for STOP. He is also a practitioner in residence at NYU Law School's Information Law Institute and a fellow 3 places at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, at Ashoka, and at New Prophets Civic Lab. He's a frequent commentator on civil rights, privacy, and technology matters. And last but certainly not least is Linda Sarsour. She is the executive director of the Arab American Association of New York and co-founder of the first Muslim online organizing platform, MPower Change. She's been at the forefront of major civil rights campaigns calling for an end to unwarranted surveillance of New York's Muslim communities and an end to police practices like stop and frisk. She also served as the national co-chair of the 2017 Women's March on Washington and currently serves on the executive board of Women's March, Inc. Okay. We are now going to ask the panelists to all address the following questions in about 5 minutes before we open it up to other questions. And that question is, how has modern police surveillance tools to surveil protesters changed or evolved in recent years? And how has your work examined or challenged these police efforts. I am going to ask Linda Sarsour to take that first question first.
Thank you so much, Professor Steinberg, and to all my fellow panelists. I'm deeply honored and humbled just to be here with all of you. I don't even know where to start, Professor Steinberg. I feel that the times have evolved, but there's also so many of the same tactics that have been used against our movements for decades. I think the evolution of the surveillance of political activists and politically active communities and marginalized people has evolved in the sense of the equipment, the gadgets, the new toys, the digital era that we find ourselves in. But the essence and the foundation of that surveillance and that targeting seems to me to be the same ways in which we saw the surveillance of civil rights movement and leaders and organizations, the targeting by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, watching really individuals and organizations that really are calling for fundamental rights in America, but specifically those who focus on holding government officials accountable, holding the government accountable, and specifically targeting law enforcement as a mechanism for accountability. Those are the people who seem to be the most targeted and the most surveilled by different levels of law enforcement. One of the interesting things about my organizing career, I've heard of law enforcement agencies or learned about them and had never heard of them before. Many of you know I'm actually the former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York, which was directly targeted by the New York Police Department. And oftentimes the Muslim community and Muslim American activists, we always knew we were under surveillance. We just had a feeling that we were under surveillance. There was something that told us it was just something that it was almost across our community agreed upon that this is what was happening. But fortunately, we had the opportunity to see an expose published by the Associated Press with secret documents leaked by the New York Police Department that really confirmed everything our Muslim communities were saying and all of our Muslim leaders were saying. People thought we were paranoid. People said that, we were exaggerating, we were playing victim. And in fact, we saw our own names inside of these documents. The Arab American Association of New York was targeted under a category called terrorism enterprise investigations. I'm talking about a social service organization that does Mother's Day parties, that provides services to refugees, that has one of the largest adult education programs in the Southwest District of Brooklyn, that has a large legal services program. We do festivals, we do parties. I mean, our organization was literally full of women and children. And here the New York Police Department decided that we would be under this kind of group of other organizations and mosques under this terrorism enterprise investigation with absolutely no probable cause and really no reason or leads to even have that category. Not only did they target us under this kind of terrorism enterprise investigation, we saw another document called confidential informant profiles. And one of the things that the law enforcement agencies have not evolved from is what I believe, or some others have called human surveillance, the usage of people who look like us and speak our languages that are used to infiltrate our organizations. And what was really pervasive about this particular document was that the confidential informant profile wasn't just a person who was going to come to our organization and ask questions. This was a person that was being recruited by the New York Police Department to serve and to nominate themselves or find a process in which to serve on the board of directors of the Arab American Association of New York. So we want people to understand this is not about someone just coming to sit in the mosque and listen to the imam give a sermon. This was about fundamentally being a part of our institutions and even having some power. If you're on a board of an organization, you have power, you have access to files, you have access to financial information of the institution. And so for me, my evolution as a Muslim American activist into the larger racial justice movement didn't really stop what I believe to be the surveillance of the organizations and groups that I organize with. I lived in Louisville, Kentucky for 4 months last summer, fighting for justice for Breonna Taylor. And we have footage watching drones that followed us home, police surveillance outside the home that we were renting in Louisville, Kentucky, the apparatus that was used to track our moves and where we were going and what we were doing, the kind of random people that would try to be in our circle to figure out what our next move was. So the surveillance apparatus is not just the New York Police Department apparatus. It's not just an FBI apparatus. It is pervasive across the country amongst the lowest levels of law enforcement to the highest levels of law enforcement. And so for me, nothing really has changed because I'm a student of history and I know COINTELPRO, and I understand that anyone who's going to speak truth to power, who's going to challenge the kind of the powers that be, will be subjected to this kind of targeting. And unfortunately, it is, you know, for many organizers, and Albert knows this, there's a lot of people that retreat, and there's a lot of people that don't want to be at the crosshairs of law enforcement. And I'll share one quick story just to give you a little bit of a perspective of what it feels like to be an organizer who understands, and I can tell you for sure, as someone who's been you know, maybe I would say a perpetual victim of surveillance. About 2 years ago, two white men were knocking on my door. And I looked out the window and I was like, why are these two white guys outside of my house in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn? And so my curiosity got the best of me, and I answered the door and I said, who are you? They said, we are the New York State FBI. And I was like, you know, immediately I got all my CARE training, and, you know, CCR training came in, and I was like, oh, I will not speak to you without my lawyer. And the FBI agents looked at me and said, absolutely, that's, you know, that's your right. We respect your rights. And then something came to me, and I just kind of got this nervous look, and they looked at me and said, listen, we just want you to know, we are not here to investigate you or anybody that you know. And I'm not going to lie to you. I said, okay. So I said, so then why are you here? And so the New York State FBI agent said to me, well, we're just here to let you know that we arrested a man in Broward County, Florida, who you might have heard was sending pipe bombs to the homes of very prominent individuals. And we want you to know, as we raided his home and vehicles, we did find 3 addresses for you and some photos. And so I said, thank you very much. They said, we were informed by our colleagues in Florida to make sure that you had this information. And I guess they were going to others. So anyway, I closed the door and I come inside of my apartment. And the only feeling that I could feel is relief. And people might be like, what are you talking about? There's FBI agents that just told you that you were on an assassination list. And I'm not Barack Obama. No one intercepts my mail. My kids could have went outside to the mailbox and got the, you know, package. If he was not yet arrested, I could have been next on the list. And I don't have the same protection as some of these other prominent people. But when I went into my house as a Muslim American racial justice activist, I felt a sigh of relief. I was more relieved to know that I was on an assassination list and not an FBI investigation list. Because as a Muslim, I also understand entrapment. I also understand secret evidence. I also understand that I could literally disappear into an abyss of law enforcement and be completely innocent and be targeted just for who I am. And so that's the level of psychological warfare that surveillance and targeting by the government of prominent activists, racial justice activists, Muslim activists, national security reform activists plays in our everyday lives.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Next, we have Albert Fox Cahn.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's really just incredible to be here on this virtual stage with so many people whose work I respect and admire. And, you know, looking at this question of how surveillance of protesters has changed over the years, I completely agree with Linda, which should come as no surprise, as I often do. But I think that when we look at the history of policing in the United States, it has been defined by this surveillance and targeting of BIPOC communities, of progressive communities, of communities calling for change for as long as we've had policing in this country. I'm a civil rights activist and a lawyer based in New York City, a city which during the colonial era, long before we had independence, had lantern laws, which forced Black and Indigenous New Yorkers to carry a lantern with them anytime they left their homes so that they could be tracked with the technology of the time, so that their bodies could be made visible to the white communities that feared them. And what we've seen is that technology hasn't changed the ideology of anti-protest surveillance in the United States. It hasn't changed the philosophy. It hasn't changed the goal. It's changed the scale because it's made it cheap. It's made it cheap to track millions where once you could track only dozens. It's made it cheap to track on a scale once unfathomable. It's made it cheap to track using artificial intelligence rather than human eyes. And so, just a few days ago with Martin Luther King Day, we were, looking back at the way that our country targeted and terrorized the civil rights movement using the tools they had at the time. But in the 60s, they could monitor a handful of civil rights leaders. They could tap their phones manually. They could use telephoto lenses. They could use those tools to try to monitor the leaders. But now any single person who raises their voice in opposition to injustice risks ending in a social media database, at risk being targeted by a geofence warrant, risks being tracked by one of these new technologies. And we don't know the repercussions. And that's part of what's so chilling. We know that the more data that the police are able to collect on so many, the more uncertain the consequences are for those who end up in these databases. But where we do have certainty, it's really just been stark and sombering just how life-changing that can be. We've seen people deported because they were flagged as being a purported gang member, labeled because they wore a certain color clothes or because they were photographed being next to someone. We've seen people being targeted for harassment by law enforcement. And yes, as Linda said, we've seen people entrapped on the flimsiest of pretexts, locked away for decades because they simply were trapped by law enforcement agents who saw someone who was vulnerable, who saw someone who could be twisted into saying things that would be used against them in court and have them locked away for the rest of their lives. And at the same time, we've seen erosion of the civil rights checks that in name protect us from this sort of abuse, but in the post 9/11 era have oftentimes become just a rubber stamp. We've seen the warrant process, for example, be turned into a quick and easy app, just a few swipes on your phone in order to get judicial consent to invade our lives. We've seen the ad tech industry, the omnipresent tracking, which is used to sell us everything we want and many things we don't, now becoming yet another policing tool, so that if police cannot get our data by force, by rule of law, they can simply purchase it on the open market. And we've seen this ideology, this anti-Black, anti-protest ideology just continue to give force, whether it's the use of air surveillance to target Black Lives Matter protesters in Minneapolis, whether it was use of the Department of Homeland Security resources to target peaceful dissent, whether it was the collaboration between so-called sanctuary cities and ICE to target those taking to the streets, or whether it was the creation of new draconian and unconstitutional laws targeting those who take to the streets in opposition to injustice. I don't think it has ever been more precarious in the history of the United States to be a protester. And that's not because of a new anti-democratic ideology. That is because of the scale of resources being brought to bear against those who speak out and against those who dissent. And really, thank you again for having me as part of this panel.
Thank you for those remarks. Next, we have Rachel Levinson-Waldman. Again, the question is, how has modern police surveillance tools to surveil protesters changed or evolved in recent years? And how has your work examined or challenged these police efforts? And I should say, if folks throughout the discussion have questions, you can just ask the question in the question and answer prompt on the bottom of your screen. Thanks, Rachel.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thank you to Ronica and the Michigan Journal of Law and Reform for setting this up and inviting me to take part in it. So I want to focus on the use of social media specifically by police. And obviously, as both Linda and Albert have talked about, there are really any number of tools kind of at law enforcement's fingertips these days to conduct surveillance. We've been doing quite a lot of work around social media, and I think there are a lot of both interesting and troubling just kind of lessons and recent developments in the realm of law enforcement use of social media. So I'm going to talk about that. And that there's really been a real explosion in the use of these tools. So, and we've been seeing this, in terms of the question about sort of how has this changed or evolved. So we've been seeing these tools in use certainly for the last 6 to 7 years, if not before that, but I think it really kind of came to the fore. First, kind of around the time of Freddie Gray protests and kind of more generally Black Lives Matter protests. So we know that in Baltimore, the Baltimore Police Department was using a tool called Geophedia to monitor Freddie Gray protests in 2015. The Baltimore County Police Department ran social media posts through facial recognition technology so they could find people in the crowd who had outstanding warrants and basically arrest them kind of directly from protests. We know that around the same period, 2014, 2015, the NYPD was monitoring Twitter posts from Black Lives Matter protesters. The ACLU of Massachusetts, founded the Boston Police Department, was also using a social media monitoring tool to monitor hashtags like Black Lives Matter, Muslim Lives Matter, right? So you see this real focus on protest, racial justice, social justice, and especially, it probably goes without saying, communities of color and activists of color. We also see this playing out in terms of not just monitoring of kind of publicly available social media, but also, and I think this also speaks to something that Linda had brought up, but a lot of use of undercover accounts. So use of social media to connect with people, basically kind of under false pretenses and usually using false identities. So one of the sort of highest profile examples is actually in Memphis. Again, after protests had erupted, this time after the police murder of a 19-year-old man named Darius Stewart. So from 2015 to 2018, the Memphis police used a fake Facebook account under the name of Bob Smith, who basically appeared to be sort of a, he was kind of portrayed as a far-left activist, a man of color. He used this persona to infiltrate private Facebook groups, to message people. It came out in trial that this was the fake persona of a Memphis Police Department detective. And using both this persona and other tools, the department constructed dossiers on activists, collected the names of people who had liked posts, things like that. And this was something that there's a long sort of story and history behind this, but this only came out because the ACLU was able to sue the police department under the terms of a long-standing consent decree. I think otherwise, this either would have stayed very much under the radar or would have been sort of known within Memphis, but wouldn't have gotten the kind of corroboration and attention that it did. And so there's been a lot of coverage over, as I say, the last probably at least 5 to 7 years about police use of social media, but it's been really kind of sort of ad hoc. When something new comes up, when there's a story up, there's publicity about it, there's coverage, but it's been really hard to get any kind of reliable sense of how police departments are using these tools, to what extent they are, what kinds of policies they have, things like that. There used to be some more reliable reporting from a sort of police association that stopped collecting or publishing this data. So in 2020, we filed a set of public records requests with 5 police departments, with the LAPD, the NYPD, the Boston Police Department, the Baltimore Police Department, and the MPD, the Metropolitan Police Department in DC, asking specifically about how they were using social media, both in terms of social media monitoring tools, what their policies were, what policies were around undercover use, what kinds of records they were keeping, were they using it for situational awareness, for criminal investigations, all of these kinds of things. And so far, we have gotten the most information, actually quite a bit of information about what LAPD has been doing. So just to give a little bit of kind of color to this, I just want to touch briefly on what we learned about what's happening in LA. And most of these other requests are still ongoing. It will come as no surprise to anyone who's dealt with these kinds of issues that to get anything out of LA, we had to sue, and we're sort of anticipating potential litigation coming down the line in the other cities as well. So we found out that since 2015, LAPD has used or at least tested out or communicated with at least 10 companies that were offering social media monitoring software. We know that LAPD used at least 2 of them, so companies called Dataminer and then again Geophedia, to track specifically First Amendment related activity. So they used Geophedia to search for search terms that included Black Lives Matter LA, Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Sandra Bland, Tamir Rice, basically all of these search terms that again are related to movements around racial justice. And even the ones that weren't explicitly, things like there's Mayor Garcetti, Chief Beck, there was really basically nothing kind of on, quote unquote, the other side, to the extent that it was focusing on kind of movements. It was really all movements for racial justice. They used Dataminer to track May Day protests. Dataminer produced these materials being sort of very proud of the fact, literally, they say notifications containing locations and images provided situational awareness and helped users track protest movements. And they include pictures of, protests at an LAPD detention center, protests of anti-Trump protests. So it's this very, very sort of explicit focus. We also found out that the LAPD was using field interview cards to collect social media identifiers that could then go into Palantir databases and kind of be fed in. And so you just see this real range kind of across the country and in all kinds of ways of use of social media, very specifically to target protesters and protest movements.
Great, thank you. And Jack Schulz.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I guess first off, too, I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of my efforts and the nice things that were said about me earlier came because I'm lifted on the shoulders of the National Lawyers Guild and their efforts in addressing a lot of what's going on in terms of social movements and the over-policing of them. A lot has been covered on social media thus far. I think that's the key. The largest increase is monitoring of social media, but distinct to here in Detroit, if not other areas, I think one growth that has been concerning has been the growing rate of public and private partnerships in surveillance. Here in Detroit, we have something called Project Greenlight, where in coordination between whether it's the police, the FBI, Homeland Security, they are working in coordination with private entities such as the Dan Gilbert, Rock Financial, Rock Security, and a lot of other local businesses to set up a web of surveillance cameras. And I can't stress, having viewed some of these myself, that it's not your fuzzy grained surveillance camera. It's something that allows for zooming on individual frames and panoramic views and real-time capture that's set to a data center. But due to the nature of this arrangement, as the cameras being set up by private businesses on private entities, it's hard to distinguish or hard to fully understand or even obtain some of that footage in litigation. I think one point that I want to touch on that was said by Mr. Cahn earlier is he said in a sentence, the ease that warrants have been able to be given to obtain surveillance on activists. And I think that needs further elaboration. Historically, there's certain Fourth Amendment expectations to surveillance and privacy that you have, but this can be circumvented through obtaining warrants. And what we have found is that with relative ease, the police and government has been able to obtain warrants to surveil individuals that they believe to be the leaders of these movements. Specifically, in my case, Detroit Will Breathe, they've obtained warrants to view and obtain the complete Facebook record and social media. So even areas where you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, warrants are obtained with relative ease. Another tactic that's been done too is the police have been confiscating the cell phones of the arrestees and then using technology to even take locked phones or password protected phones and extract the data and messages directly off the cell phones. So they've really got carte blanche in understanding what's going on. And I think to a certain extent, this has pushed organizing to the public even more, with the understanding that there is no expectation of privacy. So, you know, let's do everything out in the open, which I think can be a good thing. In regards to the personal work that I'm doing to try to address the overgrowth of surveillance, I think while the main focus of the case and a lot of the litigation that I do is excessive force and trying to combat mass arrests without individualized probable cause and things, retaliatory tactics by the police, I think a lot of the battleground too is the fight for discovery and understanding the extent that the surveillance occurs. For the law students watching, I'll remind you that the Keith case, which exposed warrantless wiretaps by the government, is called the Keith case because it arose from a discovery motion decided by the great late District Judge Damon Keith. And I believe that in these litigations that are going on around the country, a real fight to expose and to even understand what type of surveillance is going on is going to come within the discovery motions in these cases. And in at least my own subjective experience thus far, what I've seen is that there's a lot of obstructionism as to keeping secret the way that these police are surveilling individual and trying to withhold and trying to keep a shroud over their efforts, whether this is done through routine deletion of documents that you know, seemingly might be relevant, whether it's done through keeping internal investigations which contain those documents pending and open and ongoing forever, indefinitely, so that they never have to produce that. I think there's sooner or later in most of these cases, there's going to be a fight over these documents. And I think as a whole, society will understand better, or maybe hopefully some change in stopping some of this can arise out of exposing the extent that it exists.
Thank you, Jack. I want to remind the audience about the answer and question, the ability to ask questions, and we'll get to the one in the Q&A next after this question. You've all made a very powerful arguments, policy arguments about the dangers of mass surveillance, but what are the rights of protesters and activists not to be subject to surveillance? Jack mentioned the reasonable expectation of privacy, and you know, people wonder, you're out in public, you're putting stuff on social media. Do folks have a right not to be surveilled? And why don't we start out with Rachel? Not everybody has to answer every question, but if somebody wants to chime in after that, feel free.
Sure, thanks, Michael. And I'll just address this briefly, sort of again from the perspective of social media. So this is an area that is, I think, in good ways, sort of getting complicated. And the reason that I say it's good is that historically, actually, courts have been really sympathetic to law enforcement use of social media. Sort of the perspective has been, you know, anything that's out there publicly is fair game, sort of the same way that many things we do in public are considered to be fair game for watching by the police. And that even making connections undercover is fine. You know, the police have sort of said in much the same way that, you know, basically law enforcement can kind of pretend to be anyone. The idea is you always take the risk that somebody that you're talking to is a government agent or can share what you say with a government agent. So too, you know, do you have to sort of, you know, take that risk or make that assumption online? There's also basically no legislation that limits law enforcement's use of social media. So it means it's sort of up to any police department to impose their own policies or restrictions. We did a fair amount of research to find out kind of what police departments, what law enforcement agencies had publicly available policies that restricted the use of social media. We found 35. A lot of those didn't impose sort of real restrictions. That being said, I think in some ways the good news is that there's a lot of, and Jack was alluding to this as well, there's just a lot of development in the arena, especially of Fourth Amendment rights, but First Amendment as well. So, and in thinking about sort of how that could play out for social media, I think there are some kind of avenues that I think are likely to be much more explored. So one is that social media really does allow the accumulation of so much sensitive information. And the Supreme Court and other courts have recognized that when you have these kind of digital tools or authorities in the digital age that allow you to collect and assess and kind of combine and analyze so much more information than would have been available to, you know, just a police officer kind of standing on a corner, that actually changes the magnitude of the Fourth Amendment impact. So I think we actually are going to see that playing out in the context of social media. There's also, the courts are already reconsidering what's called the third party doctrine. Again, basically the idea that a third party can kind of do what they want with your information. So I think we could see that also play out in the context of social media in terms of this idea of kind of having to take the risk that somebody that you're connecting with as a government agent. And then also on that piece, I do think there's an argument to be made that although it may be the case that a law enforcement officer could show up, say, at a meeting, or even try to infiltrate an organization, become a member of leadership, that there are at least potentially an understanding that oftentimes there is like a long-term kind of investment by a law enforcement agency in appearing to be a member of a targeted group. There is some potentially possibility of kind of testing that out. There's also just a lot more kind of investment of resources that goes into doing that in person, to kind of adopting a persona, appearing to be that person. Those restrictions really don't exist online. You could pretend to be 25 different people, infiltrate 25 different groups. It's much easier. The barrier to entry is much lower. And so I think I also sort of have hope that courts may see that distinction and kind of impose more limitations on use of social media in all these different ways.
So I just wanted to follow up with the slightly more pessimistic view, because I don't think the courts have been good protectors of the right to protest. I think that was particularly true at the moments we needed it most, such as, in New York, we've had one of the longest standing consent decrees in the country. This is the so-called Handshoe consent decree, which was created after the NYPD systematically infiltrated, monitored anti-war protests back during Vietnam. And there was eventually a consent decree because even though you're allowed to, in theory, as a police department, monitor what people do in public, this sort of systematic infiltration was seen as chilling the First Amendment right to protest, to assemble. And what we saw was that right then being watered down in the aftermath of 9/11, a rollback of those consent decrees. And that enabled the sort of mass infiltration of mosques that Linda was talking about. And so what gives me hope on when it comes to the individual rights of protesters is the amazing work we're seeing by grassroots activists around the country to pass new laws that outlaw some of the most abusive tactics. And I'm thinking here of the more than a dozen localities that have banned facial recognition, in large part because of its ability to monitor thousands of protesters with a single camera, that have enacted so-called CCOPS laws, community control police surveillance laws, that say that it's civilians, not police officers, that make these choices. But I do hope that while I hope that we do see the courts taking on a more rights protective stance in evaluating the Fourth Amendment impact of these novel policing tactics, I think that our best source of hope at the moment is really coming from those community legislative efforts.
Thank you. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. And this is one of the questions in the Q&A. How does this group feel about the use of high-tech surveillance and infiltration techniques in dealing with white supremacist groups such as Charlottesville. And relatedly, the use of these techniques about the January 6th takeover of the Capitol was very prevalent, and a lot of people who might be sympathetic to the positions you're taking may be feeling a little differently now. How do you address that?
I'll start, Professor Steinberg, as someone who's not a lawyer and just someone who's an activist, just so people hear that perspective. Racists have a right to be racist. Racists have a right to hold meetings and say racist stuff about other groups of people. They have the right to hate. They have a right to do and be, unfortunately, whether we like it or not. And I'm going to fight for the rights of racists to be racist, because when we start imposing, or encouraging or demanding more surveillance of quote white supremacists, or trying to build countering violent extremism programs that are targeting white supremacists, eventually what that does is it actually hurts Black and brown people more. And so my perspective is, unless there's reasonable suspicion, unless there's data that can identify people at those, white supremacists who have history of violence, precedent to commit acts of violence against, other people or communities, or against the Capitol, and there's precedent for that, we cannot, as protesters, keep encouraging a more pervasive surveillance for another group, and then say that we don't want to be impacted by the same type of surveillance tactics. So I can't sit here in good conscience and say, I don't deserve to be surveilled, the organizations I'm with don't deserve to be surveilled, and then say, but the white supremacists do, because this is America. We're allowed to have, very different views. And sometimes, the views that opposing forces have are absolutely reprehensible, and they are absolutely outrageous. And for me, as long as it's not an incitement of violence against communities, we have to be very careful about what types of new laws and what types of new policies we want to be implemented against others that we know for sure that history has told us will come back to bite us, and bite people of color and marginalized people. So it's very complicated, because I think a lot of people immediately after January 6th or after Charlottesville, or as they fight against programs like countering violent extremism, programs that target Muslim communities, what they'll say is, but where is the one for the white people? Where is the one for the white supremacists? And people are doing that out of good intention, but don't always understand that the ramifications are going to come back and harm our communities and harm activists like me and others.
Jack?
Yeah, I just like to echo Linda. She covered a lot of what I was going to say, but I think overall, I think it's wrong to assume that increased surveillance will lead to anything positive on either side. So if increased surveillance has proven disproportionate and disproportionate in affecting people of color and things along those lines, I think an expectation that it has some positive when looking at white supremacists is just misplaced. I do think what is interesting to me is that not so much one side being over surveilled or the use of surveillance in both, but the difference in treatment of what has been obtained through the surveillance when it comes to the white supremacists versus the people of color and the movements against police violence. Locally, if there is an announced march in Detroit, the police are there an hour prior to the march because they've been monitoring it, every post about it for weeks. But it's no secret to anyone with social media that what happened on January 6th at our nation's capital was talked about openly. And despite how open it was talked about, the government's policing in reaction to that was definitely are arguably inadequate in the eyes of many. So I think that what's interesting is the thought that, well, the statement that, well, we can't say we don't want this, but we want it for them. And I don't think anyone's actually saying that. But I think the takeaway should be that it's not good for anyone when it's only being used as a tool to suppress social movements that the government doesn't identify with or challenges them.
I just wanted to, I completely agree with Jack and Linda. And I think we have a very powerful example, and that's the Antiterrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which was passed in the aftermath of Oklahoma City, passed in response to a deadly attack by a right-wing white man. And what was that law used to do? It was used systematically to target BIPOC detainees in federal prisons to expedite their executions. It was used by the Trump administration to help kill dozens of men in their final days in office. And so we know this pattern is clear. What powers we give the government in the name of targeting right-wing extremists inevitably will be turned on BIPOC communities. And even more importantly, we know that, as Jack said, we didn't need this sort of expanded surveillance powers to know about January 6th. They were selling t-shirts, advertising January 6th Civil War on the National Mall in front of the Capitol. People knew this was coming, but more importantly, we didn't even need this technology to identify the attackers afterwards. My organization, Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, we looked at every single guilty plea coming out of the insurrection, and we found that there were only 3 cases where they used facial recognition. And those cases, they had other evidence. But in over 100 cases, in the vast majority of cases, they used tips from the public. That's what it took, a wanted poster and a tip line. And that got us the people who did this, the people who gave quotes to the press and live streamed their felonies. And then we didn't need some sprawling surveillance system, which will then be turned on BLM activists and other BIPOC community members.
I'm going to ask the question in the Q&A area. What are panelists' thoughts on surveillance? That is, recording by citizens to hold power to account. The last 10 years, we've seen the rise of cell phone recordings of police brutality. Now we have Facebook launching camera glasses. Do you see an opportunity for citizens to restore the balance of power with surveillance technology? What are the risks and opportunities?
I guess as a starter point, I would say that I think that cell phone recording of police activity has been a positive many times, because the courts, as well as internal investigation boards of the police, seemingly are unwilling to believe the average citizen unless there is ironclad video evidence of abuse. And while I'm not here to encourage constant surveillance or even individuals feeling the need to have to record things, I think it's just the reality that unless it's documented, the courts and the police will not believe you.
I wanted to just bring out the words of Benjamin that, technology will always replicate the power dynamics of the society in which it is used. And, while it can be helpful in some cases to have this sort of citizen surveillance, let's look at the structures that surround how it's then deployed. We have police officers who are able to commandeer that footage, who are able to subpoena it, even when it's not something that the member of the public wants to share. We see people who, well-intentioned, are photographing, videotaping protests, and then having that footage used by prosecutors and officers to target the people that they were trying to help. And so I do worry that for every one case where that sort of public surveillance is helpful, there may be even more cases where it's then being weaponized by the police, by the prosecutors, by the broader legal system against the members of the public who want to record. And I think this also raises huge ethical issues for the press and how they videotape and report on protests as well, because we also see their footage being commandeered in the same way.
So what is the solution to the extent that the Constitution doesn't protect our rights to be free from surveillance. What needs to happen legislatively? What do activists do to prevent themselves from being the targets of surveillance? Give us a path forward here.
I can start, Professor Steinberg. I mean, as an activist, I think Albert and Rachel and Jack, of course, from the kind of litigation perspective and from the policy perspective, there are legislations and other ways that you can kind of limit the ways in which the government violates our rights. So you can't stop them from violating it all the way, but maybe there's a way to limit that. But as an activist and organizer, we need to be diligent and in our work and in the ways in which we organize and the ways that we create spaces for strategy. And as a Muslim American activist, a lot of folks that have kind of organized around me have in the beginning were like, "You're insane. This is what's going on here." And I said, "You just can't let anybody in your space." Being able to also be diligent about who's in our space, who are they connected to, why are they here, what is the purpose of having them in a certain place is important. And oftentimes over the 20 years that I've been organizing, there have been people who just by the virtue of being asked certain questions disappeared off the face of the earth because they knew that at some point their cover would be blown as people who I believed were infiltrators in our work. Even people who are coming to intern at organizations, oftentimes nonprofits have such low capacity that they're willing to welcome anybody and everybody who says, "I'm here to give you my time." And we've had, for example, at the Arab American Association of New York, even someone who's a volunteer, there's an extensive questionnaire that you fill out, your prior experience. We want to know where you are, have kind of a HR file on you. Just because you're not someone who is an employee doesn't mean we don't want to know who you are. If you're going to come and have access to our clients and be able to sit in office spaces where we have client information, we have a responsibility to the people that we serve. And so this is a movement that's not a free for all. I mean, of course you can come to a protest, anybody can come to a protest, but letting people into very intimate spaces in the movement is something that we have to be really careful about. And what I tell activists and organizers, and especially folks who are here, who are, not only wanting to be, lawyers, but people who do and maybe are already part of movements, is that this is it, that we have to be able to still move forward, knowing that anytime you stand up to the powers that be, you will be and become a target on different levels. Sometimes you will live your entire career probably under surveillance, never really feel it on a personal level, but know that your social media is being tracked. I mean, a lot of people criticize me in the movement because my emails are like, "Thanks, great job, sounds interesting," because I know that every single email that I write is somewhere in a file somewhere. I don't do long threads in messaging. I don't chat with people in Facebook chats. Sometimes anything you say anywhere on social media or in emails can and will be used against you. And so if there's a sensitive matter in the movement that we're organizing around, a police death, and we're trying to organize, you're meeting me in person. And sometimes we have outdoor meetings and trying to find different ways to protect ourselves and be able to move forward. And just one quick example about really trying to get around all the surveillance is that, back in last summer, we were arrested outside the home of Attorney General Daniel Cameron in Kentucky, in Louisville, Kentucky. And the law enforcement was so outraged because they were trying to figure out, how the hell did we know where Daniel Cameron lived? And how were we able to get to the front door? I mean, I could knock on the man's door without any leads that law enforcement had to kind of put a barricade around his house. And so we were called the Louisville 87. And that wasn't happenstance. That wasn't just because the law enforcement is stupid and just couldn't figure it out. It was because we did everything that we could to make sure that information was confidential. The way in which we strategized our direct action was in ways where we were not indoor spaces. We were outdoors. We were literally like in a random park somewhere trying to have a conversation about what we do, when we do. Even the people that we organized for the civil disobedience did not know we were going to Daniel Cameron's house until we got to the front of his house. And I had to take a bullhorn and say, "Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this direct action with us. This is Daniel Cameron's house." And that was the type of confidentiality and such meticulous organizing, knowing and under the context of knowing we were a group and individuals in our group maybe, I mean, I'm sure are still under some sort of surveillance. So I just want to say, you got to keep moving forward. You got to keep organizing. You cannot allow this to hinder us fighting, because it is not a crime to fight for civil and human rights in the United States of America. It is not a crime to organize and hold those who we have elected to represent the interest of our people. It is not a crime. And no matter how much government wants to tell me it's a crime, it is not a crime. And we have to kind of find the mighty few that will continue to move forward, even under this type of targeting that our government has done since its founding.
It's hard to say anything following Linda, just always one of the most powerful voices for justice in the United States. But I would just add, it's so crucial to stay vocal. It's so indispensable to also stay local, to focus on what are the ways that you can, change these, the surveillance state in your local community, whether that means even looking at the policies you have at the law school, at the university. What are the technologies that your campus is using, and looking at what you can do at the city, at council level, because you can have millions of people calling out for change at the federal level and have it fall on deaf ears. But with just a handful of people, you can rewrite the agenda at the local level. You can have such a transformative impact. And so that's what gives me hope, is just the momentum we see city by city, town by town, county by county, to outlaw these technologies and really protect the indispensable right to protest.
And I'll just add on quickly, really, to plus one. I mean, I completely agree with Albert about sort of the power of Linda's words, and then also to plus one sort of on a practical level, what Albert was saying. I do also think in the realm of social media monitoring, because the landscape is so open, there really are huge opportunities to make change, especially at the local level. I think it is unlikely that police departments really are going to adopt their own particularly restrictive policies. Why would they? Because there aren't any sort of outside forces. But it does mean that there are opportunities to push for local legislation, even push for state legislation. And there are a lot of different ways to think about it. We've published about what some sort of reasonable limitations on social media would look like, things like warrants for using undercover accounts, really, really robust limitations around using social media sort of for situational awareness, which is where there's just so much slippage and so much sort of allowance for watching protesters, tethering any collection of information to, an existing criminal investigation, to, reasonable belief of a crime, not keeping records, all of these sorts of things. There are a lot of ways to think about how to kind of ratchet up the protections. And especially because there has been a lot of movement at the local level generally in terms of kind of surveillance, transparency, and accountability. I think there are great ways to think about how to kind of explicitly fold social media in on that as well.
I guess I would add as well, I think that there is some promise to local legislators adapting laws that deal with some of this surveillance prior to it growing past what it is, and hopefully dealing with what's already existing. But I think that, to echo what Linda's saying, that only comes through the pressure that comes through the activists themselves and the motivation and the movement itself. And I believe that I just hope there's a way that we can develop and understand the extent of this and get it and communicate it effectively to the public, because I really believe that the general public doesn't have a full understanding of the level of surveillance that exists. And I think that any objective person would see it and just be offended by it if they truly knew. And I think that might be a tool to get more people active and motivated, and through that pressure develop more legislation.
Well, we are approaching 1 o'clock, and while this conversation could have gone on for 3 or 5 hours, we only have an hour. But I learned a tremendous amount about the extent of surveillance of protest movements, and got a little bit of hope going forward. I'd like to thank everybody who attended, including the FBI. I'd like to thank the Journal for Law Reform, including Ronica, Peter, Hannah, and others for arranging this. And I'd especially like to thank our panelists. We're at a webinar function, but I'm clapping for the entire university. It was really inspiring, and thanks for a great event.
Thank you all so much for attending. The discussion was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure everyone else did. And we had a giant class of student attendees too that aren't showing up in participants. So thank you to student attendees. Yeah, I just really wanted to thank you all again. It's wonderful. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you for coming.